There's a strange kind of silence that hits a soul when they realize they pushed away the one person who held the key to their healing. Not just loneliness, but a full body ache that won't respond to time or logic. Somewhere right now, someone is wide awake while the rest of the world sleeps, wrestling with the echo of their own choices. Not because of guilt alone, but because they've finally understood the weight of what they let slip through their fingers. They weren't prepared for the aftermath, for the quiet collapse that comes after losing something priceless. They thought you were replaceable, forgettable, just another voice in the background. But when you vanished, the whole room changed temperature. Their days feel colorless now, like sunlight through a cracked window, never quite reaching them. The gravity in their life has shifted, and they don't know how to live without your energy anchoring them. And here's the twist that keeps them from sleep. They didn't just lose a person, they lost the one soul who could have led them out of their own darkness. The one who carried answers inside their presence, who offered light without needing to say a word. There's no shortcut to rebuild what they broke. No substitute for a spirit that was designed to uplift and recalibrate the room. What they abandoned was more than rare, it was irreplaceable. If your heart overflows with God's blessings, let that love shine. Click the super thank you button and give $40 or more to plant seeds of faith that will impact countless lives. Your generosity reflects His abundance. Be a vessel of His grace and watch His kingdom flourish through you. You weren't some accident in their timeline. You weren't just a chapter in their story. You were the living map to a version of them they were too afraid to become. They thought your presence was temporary. They had no idea you were the compass they'd spend years trying to recreate. And now? They scroll through old messages like archaeologists digging through ruins, looking for the moment they unknowingly closed the door on their own rescue. See, some souls only understand love once it's silent. They only recognize protection once it stops shielding them. You gave endlessly. Not with grand speeches, but with small, holy moments, your ability to calm storms with a glance, your way of making people feel like they had purpose just by standing near you. And now, the absence of that gift is teaching them more than your presence ever could. They thought they were just walking away from a person. What they walked away from was divine alignment, spiritual immunity, and sacred access. You didn't need recognition because you were the miracle, hidden in plain sight. They prayed for signs, and when the answer showed up in your eyes, they dismissed it as coincidence. Now every delay, every misstep, every closed door in their life reminds them of what they threw away. But this isn't about revenge. This is about awakening. The pain they feel is not your doing, it's their soul waking up, years too late. It's the ripple effect of rejecting something holy. You were the invitation to rise, and they declined. And now they live with the echo of that decision, a haunting reminder that some doors, once closed, do not open again. Some connections don't require explanation. From the very first exchange, something ancient stirred in them, a knowing too deep to articulate. Not with words, but with instinct. You didn't just appear, you disrupted. Your presence was like a mirror they hadn't agreed to stand in front of. Instead of honoring that reflection, they panicked. It wasn't your goodness they hated, it was the way your existence revealed everything they weren't willing to confront. They never told you what happened in that first moment behind their eyes. 1,000 alarms went off. Not because you were dangerous, but because you were different. You didn't chase. You didn't beg. You simply stood in your fullness. And that threatened the fragments they'd carefully disguised as a personality. They weren't expecting someone who didn't need their approval. Someone who radiated truth without effort. Someone who wasn't playing the same broken game. If you've been touched by God's goodness, don't keep it to yourself. Click super thank you and sow a gift of $40 or more to help spread His light. Your giving becomes a ripple of grace, blessing hearts and building his kingdom. Let his overflow pour through you. What followed wasn't random. It was method. The unraveling was calculated. They chipped away at your clarity with quiet judgment, cloaked insults, and invisible tests. They needed to know if you were real, but more than that, they needed to see if you could be broken. And when you weren't, when your steadiness didn't shatter under pressure, that's when the discomfort turned to suspicion. You made it too easy to feel safe. And for people raised in emotional minefields, safety feels like a trap. They mistook your calm for control, your compassion for manipulation. Every time you chose grace over ego, it disoriented them. You didn't just challenge their wounds, you exposed the walls they built around them. And people don't tear those walls down. They throw rocks from behind them. So they crafted storms. Not because you deserved chaos, but because they couldn't survive stillness. Stillness made them listen. Stillness made them feel. Stillness demanded accountability. And you, unknowingly, became a force that forced them to hear their own internal noise. That's what made you unbearable. Not because you caused pain, but because you reminded them how long they'd been living in it. The more love you offered, the more unsteady they became. They labeled you too much because they didn't feel like enough. They called you intense because you refused to play small. They couldn't receive you because they never learned how to receive themselves. So instead, they reached for familiar fires, the kind that burn, not warm. The kind that validate their chaos instead of healing it. Now they're left chasing echoes of the peace they once dismissed. Surrounded by distractions, but haunted by the absence of realness. And in quiet moments, when the noise settles, a single question repeats like a whisper they can't silence. Why did I push away the one who came in silence, but carried everything I was looking for? Power doesn't always show up with noise. Sometimes, it moves like silence in a room full of static. That's what you were, an unseen force that rearranged the atmosphere without ever asking for attention. They thought it was luck that followed them, ease that just happened to arrive, but what they never realized is that you were carrying a kind of invisible alignment. While they craved applause, you were protecting futures. While they chased credit, you were anchoring miracles. They were too distracted by their own reflection to notice the clarity you were offering. While they questioned your sincerity, you were doing exactly what they claimed to desire, only better. You stood when they collapsed. You believed when they doubted themselves. You showed up in ways they never even articulated out loud. And instead of honoring the rare, they grew suspicious. They weren't terrified of losing you, they were terrified of being seen by someone who didn't fall for their disguise. You weren't built for shallow interactions. You arrived without packaging, without pretense, just truth wrapped in presence. Not everyone is prepared to look into eyes that carry the weight of knowing. You didn't water down your essence for the sake of comfort. You held out the full offering, depth, clarity, awakening, and they were still reaching for illusions. You weren't asking for worship. You were offering transformation. But transformation requires courage, and they were still loyal to their fear. To them, your love felt unfamiliar, even threatening. Not because you were overwhelming, but because they had never seen consistency that didn't demand something in return. Your authenticity reminded them of everything they never became. So instead of rising to meet your frequency, they tried to dilute it. They tried to reduce what they couldn't replicate. And when that failed, they called you difficult. Not because you were, but because they couldn't decode what had no mask. Their betrayal wasn't an accident, it was a calculation. They planned their exit while still standing in your presence. They studied how to leave without confronting what they were abandoning. They labeled your boundaries as obstacles, your standards as restrictions, your light as inconvenient. In truth, They wanted a gift without the responsibility of honoring it. They didn't want to grow, they wanted to stay the same and still be praised for it. While you were planting seeds in their barren places, they were mapping out how to retreat without guilt. They rehearsed excuses before they ever said goodbye. And when they left, they didn't just walk away from you, they walked away from the very shift they secretly prayed for. You held out evolution, and they chose repetition. Not because they didn't care, but because care requires effort, and effort reveals truth. Now they sit in the echo of what they forfeited. Surrounded by noise, yet unable to find the clarity you gave effortlessly. What they once dismissed as too much now feels like the only thing that made sense. But the door they exited wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. And re-entry doesn't come by knocking. It comes by becoming. Something they never intended to do. They never understood that you weren't just offering affection, you were handing over a key to realms they couldn't have accessed on their own. You arrived carrying insight that would have cleared their confusion, endurance that would have carried their vision, and an inner stillness that could have silenced every war they'd been fighting alone. But because they couldn't measure it or label it, they misjudged it. They swapped a doorway to transformation for something loud, reckless, and easy to reach, never realizing that the cost of comfort was the collapse of everything good. You didn't show up just to hold space. You were sent to unlock dormant potential. You were an invitation to evolve. But because your power wore skin and not a spotlight, they missed it. They expected breakthroughs to feel dramatic, not quiet. They looked for miracles and thunder, but you came as a whisper with instructions. They didn't see that your example was the blueprint. Instead of recognizing the divine in the ordinary, they rejected it and labeled it too human. The person they chose in your place wasn't an accident, it was a mirror of their resistance to growth. You came to stabilize, and they chose instability. You came to build, and they chose chaos in disguise. Every trait they dismissed in you became the exact absence they'd regret. The contrast wasn't subtle, it was spiritual friction. They didn't just betray loyalty, they abandoned alignment. There are spiritual laws that activate the moment sacred energy is mishandled. The betrayal didn't just hurt you, it triggered correction. And not because you asked for vengeance, but because divine order always balances itself. When the sacred is disregarded, heaven doesn't whisper, it intervenes. The aftermath they're facing now isn't karma, it's justice for rejecting what was designed to protect them. What they mistook as your personality was actually their safety net. You were the buffer between them and everything waiting to destroy them. They thought their life was progressing because of their own decisions, but in reality, it was your presence filtering out the danger. You didn't need applause to keep showing up. You stood guard when they didn't even know an attack was near. They mocked your depth, but your depth was their shelter. And when that shelter withdrew, the storm came fast. Not because you cursed them, but because mercy knows when it's no longer welcome. They violated what was covering them and expected peace to stay. But protection doesn't stay where respect is absent. You weren't emotional support, you were divine reinforcement, walking quietly beside them while they self-sabotaged with a smile. Now, the very choice they made is unraveling their life. The person they chased turned out to be a lesson, not a partner. They lost appetite for anything genuine because they fed on illusions. And what they once called freedom now feels like a trap. They thought they upgraded. In reality, they traded wholeness for performance, substance for spectacle, gold for gravel, and the regret they carry will outlast every excuse they tell themselves to sleep at night. They overlooked you because you didn't beg to be noticed. You walked in wholeness, not performance. You were grounded, not loud, steady, not desperate. And in a world obsessed with noise, your stillness made them uncomfortable. They confused your self-sufficiency with indifference. They thought your lack of drama meant lack of power. In truth, it meant mastery. You weren't there to be consumed, you were there to reflect what they refused to become. But they weren't seeking truth, they were searching for something easier to manipulate. Regret doesn't always sound like an apology. Sometimes, it hides behind silence, or shows up as restlessness. That's what they're feeling now, an ache that won't be named, but can't be escaped. They replay moments they never honored, kindness they never reciprocated, presence they never valued. They remember the way you stayed even when you had every reason to leave. They remember your quiet loyalty, your strength that didn't demand recognition. And now their peace tastes hollow. Their relationships crumble without explanation. But you were the stability they ignored, the hidden framework holding their life in place. While their structure fell inward, yours reached outward. What they thought would break you actually peeled away everything you didn't need. Their abandonment became the invitation that pulled you into higher territory. You rose in silence, because growth doesn't need an audience. Their betrayal, once meant to diminish you, became the very ground from which your new self emerged. What they walked away from became the thing you walked into, freedom. At first, they celebrated. Painted false stories. Shared distorted versions of the truth. They thought discarding you would come without consequence. But something in them remained unsettled. You didn't respond with chaos. You didn't beg or chase. You simply disappeared and kept descending. That shook something in them. They expected retaliation. Instead, they witnessed your resilience. They expected tears. Instead, they watched you build. And slowly, they realized you weren't just a phase, you were a lesson. Now their world is filled with replicas that don't resonate. No matter how many hands they hold, the absence of you lingers. Not because you're still present, but because nothing feels real anymore. They see your reflection in moments they can't enjoy, and people who can't measure up, and spaces that feel more like performance than presence. You were the standard. The mirror they tried to shatter, but the pieces keep cutting. They're learning the hard way that some decisions echo forever. That walking away from depth has consequences. Not because you cursed them, but because they dismissed what was sacred. They thought they were freeing themselves. But what they lost was the very thing protecting them from themselves. And now, life reminds them in quiet, persistent ways that peace has a source, and they disconnected from it. You never had to prove your worth. You were always the rare find, the solid ground, the hidden gem. But sometimes people don't recognize value until the light goes out. They thought they could replace your spirit with noise, with attention, with distractions. But now they sit with the truth they tried to outrun. They traded something timeless for something temporary. And what they lost wasn't just love, it was access to a better version of themselves they may never meet again. When something sacred walks away, it doesn't just leave, it shifts the gravity in the room. Your absence wasn't just a gap in their daily routine, it was the collapse of the invisible structure that had been holding their world together. They didn't just miss the sound of your voice or the warmth of your presence. They began feeling the emptiness where your stability used to stand. Every moment they had taken for granted returned like a quiet verdict, whispering, "You had something rare, and you lost it." They believed they were leveling up, but they walked straight into a hollow imitation. The choice they made looked appealing from a distance, but the closer they got, the more artificial it felt. They were drawn to noise, thinking it was passion. Drawn to flash, mistaking it for substance. But now that the surface shine has dulled, they're face to face with something they never expected, the realization that you were never just a good person, you were the blueprint they can't replicate. There was a method to their withdrawal. Every delayed reply, every inconsistent effort, every time they pulled away just enough to keep you reaching, it was all calculated. They thought they could bait your loyalty while withholding theirs. They assumed you'd break your own heart trying to win theirs. But you weren't playing games. You were taking notes. You noticed the patterns, cataloged the shifts, and decided not to announce your departure. You simply vanished. And with you, the illusion they built began to crack. They never imagined silence could hit harder than confrontation. But when you disappeared without noise, it echoed louder than anything they'd ever heard. You were the one they thought would always return. But this time, there was no encore. No explanation. Just a void. And now, every smile they fake around someone new feels strained. Every conversation feels flat. The presence they chose over yours can't mirror the depth you offered effortlessly. The soul-level connection they once had has been replaced by emotional scaffolding, and it's collapsing. They didn't just lose you, they lost a rhythm, a resonance. The peace that once followed them into rooms has evaporated. And no matter how many bodies they surround themselves with, none carry your frequency. What they left behind wasn't just a relationship, it was alignment. And now that alignment haunts them. Not as a ghost, but as a contrast. They taste the difference in every shallow laugh. They hear it in every conversation that dies too quickly. They feel it in the way their spirit tightens when they hear your name. There's no way to rehearse real love. And they've learned that the hard way. They thought they could teach someone else to replace you, to mimic the way you loved, how you spoke, how you made the air feel lighter just by walking into a space. But you weren't acting. You were flowing. And that flow doesn't come from charm or effort, it comes from alignment with something higher. Now they're stuck trying to recreate something they didn't understand, with someone who doesn't carry what you did. You didn't have to slam the door for them to realize it was shut. Your quiet was enough. And now they live in the echo of that final moment, the day the silence got too loud, the day the presence they took for granted became the absence that won't stop roaring. Not because you want revenge, but because truth has a sound. And every day, it's getting harder for them to drown it out. Some people don't realize a blessing when it walks through the door, they only understand it once it disappears. You weren't a coincidence in their life. You were the shift. Not a temporary companion, but a pivotal moment in their spiritual timeline. You didn't arrive just to be another connection. You entered with sacred purpose, carrying answers disguised as conversation, alignment disguised as presence. But instead of reverence, they responded with resistance. They didn't recognize you as the catalyst. And now they're staring at the aftermath, trying to piece together what they shattered with their own hands. They thought your presence was optional. Something they could take or leave without consequence. But you were never an extra, you were the intervention. A divine interruption to their cycles of dysfunction. You were placed in their path not to entertain but to awaken. To gently disrupt their patterns and elevate their perspective. But they mistook the depth of your stillness for passivity, and your grace for dependence. Now, they're left praying for what they already had and threw away because it didn't arrive wrapped in thunder and spectacle. You didn't pour into them because you needed their approval. You did it because you were built for it. Built to nurture, to stabilize, to lift others without losing yourself. They misunderstood your consistency as attachment. They thought your empathy made you fragile. But what they never realized was that you were operating from a strength that doesn't show up in shouting matches, it shows up in consistency. You were the force that steadied the atmosphere. The quiet influence that kept things from falling apart. The presence that reset the entire frequency of the room. When you extended patience, it wasn't a lack of options. It was conviction. You stayed not because you couldn't leave, but because you were following divine instruction. You were sent to anchor something inside them, to help them rise when they were sinking. You supported their dreams with no strings. You stood by them when even they didn't believe in their own potential. But instead of appreciation, they saw obligation. Instead of honor, they gave neglect. And now that you've gone quiet, the silence is louder than anything they ever heard from your lips. Now the truth hits with clarity they can't ignore. The emotional scaffolding has collapsed. The spark is gone. The peace has vanished. And they don't know how to stabilize because you were the one carrying the weight the whole time. You didn't just offer support, you were the support system. You didn't just encourage them, you infused them with belief. What they thought was just kindness was actually a spiritual infrastructure. And now, they're scrambling for substitutes that don't hold the same power. In the stillness you left behind, they finally saw what you had been doing in secret. All those quiet prayers. The unspoken intercession. The encouragement they thought came easy. Now that it's gone, they feel the spiritual hunger. They're starting to see you weren't simply kind-hearted, you were a guardian in disguise. A protector they dishonored. A light they dismissed while searching for something flashier. And now they're asking the sky for help, not realizing they silenced the answer when they turned away from you. They're beginning to understand what true loss feels like. Not the loss of a person, but the collapse of everything that person upheld. They thought your absence would sting briefly. But this isn't a momentary regret, it's a soul-level consequence. Because what left wasn't just a relationship. What left was divine architecture, carried by someone who asked for nothing but gave them everything. And now that structure is gone, and they're standing in ruins, wondering how to rebuild without the blueprint. There's something sacred about what rises after destruction. The very moment they assumed they'd shattered you was the moment the ground beneath your life began to shift in your favor. What was meant to humiliate became the spark of divine transformation. You didn't just recover, you restructured. You shed every outdated version of yourself and stepped into a dimension they were never meant to access. You weren't broken, you were reborn in the ruins. They tried to fill your absence with noise, louder voices, bolder displays, exaggerated affection. But performance has a shelf life, and masks get heavy over time. The person they parade around may light up rooms with sound, but not with presence. They chase attention like oxygen, always one step away from suffocating under the pressure to appear fulfilled. And still, it can't compare to the quiet force you were, the kind that shifted entire atmospheres just by standing still. No matter how many smiles they force into photos, their soul remembers authenticity. That new face may be more dramatic, more eager, more showy, but they don't bring balance. They don't bring the unspoken understanding that once held their chaos in check. You never had to rehearse love. You never had to exaggerate peace. You just existed, and the entire environment aligned. Now, even their loudest joys echo back hollow, and the stillness reveals what's really missing. What haunts them now is not the image of you leaving, it's the knowledge of what they let go. It's not that they lost someone, they lost something. They lost access to emotional shelter, to spiritual grounding, to the one person who could navigate their storms without a map. They didn't just betray trust, they disrupted a covenant. And now they're standing in the ruins of a connection they never understood until it vanished. The regret doesn't only come from loneliness. It comes from realizing they were tested and failed. Life handed them something that didn't come with warnings or labels but carried weight, protection, and alignment. And they traded it for aesthetics. Now they feel the difference, not in public, but in the moments when the noise dies and they're left with nothing but their thoughts. That's where the weight presses down, when the stage lights dim and real life begins. What cuts deepest isn't your absence, it's your evolution. You didn't just move on, you elevated. You became the version of yourself that no longer fits in their narrative. You are unreachable not because of pride, but because of growth. They can't contact who you've become with the same energy that betrayed who you were. And now, the distance isn't just emotional, it's dimensional. You live in a realm they refuse to rise to. They didn't fear losing you, they feared facing themselves. You reflected everything they weren't ready to deal with. You showed them where their smiles were fake, their promises hollow, their love conditional. But instead of adjusting, they attacked the reflection. Now they live with the shards, unable to forget what they saw, unable to replace what they lost, unable to escape the truth that you were the revelation they weren't willing to receive.